welcome back to AV Chess Lab, and welcome to round 13 of the Tata Steel Masters tournament, as we will cover the game between Magnus Carlsen with the white pieces and MVL with the black pieces. These two players are not having the best tournament thus far, but a victory on the last round could just be that positive thing they can take home with them and could mean everything moving forward. So let's just jump straight into the game. We have d4 by Magnus, knight f6 by MVL. And MVL has a big problem. Every player is getting very good targeted preparation against him. And it's because he always plays the same thing. So against d4, you're always going to get that Grunfeld defense. And against e4, he always gets the Sicilian Nyador variation. So c4 by Magnus, g6, knight to c3, d5. And what a surprise, we have a Grunfeld defense played by MVL. C takes d5, knight takes d5, e4 by Magnus, knight takes on c3, b takes c3, bishop g7, and queen a4 check by Magnus. And true to his style, he goes for an offbeat line. Maybe he was also playing with MVL's head a little bit, considering that he's not playing his best tournament so far, and he wanted to test him in this line here with a4, with queen to a4. Queen d7 by MVL, Magnus goes queen to a3, b6, knight to f3, just continue to develop his pieces, c5, and bishop to e3. Notice something very important here by Magnus is if he tries to go for this, instead of bishop e3, d takes on c5 instead, trying to win a pawn here. After bishop to b7, hitting the pawn on e4 with the bishop, c takes b6, a takes on b6, queen to b3 since the queen was being hit by the rook on a8, the bishop takes on e4, and it is black who is actually playing for a win in this situation. So of course Magnus was not going to play for this, and he goes for bishop to e3 instead. Castles by MVL, rook to d1 by Magnus, and now the threat of d takes e5 is actually on the board. So MVL goes for c takes d4, c takes d4, and queen to d6. And although this move is still within the realm of opening theory, and I'm sure MVL has studied this very profoundly, playing this move against Magnus is a very big mistake. It's going to lead to some positional encounter in which Magnus is just the best player in the world. So instead, I think MVL should have gone for bishop to b7, knight to c6, put his rooks in the center, play e6, f5, and just have a perfectly good game. Instead, he chooses this queen to d6, and as you will see, he gets in a lot of trouble. Magnus continues with queen takes d6, e takes d6, and he occupies the only open c5, the only open file in the game with rook to c1. Bishop to b7 by MVL, targeting the pawn on e4 with the bishop. So of course Magnus has to protect that, and he goes for bishop to d3, knight to c6, continue to develop, and king to d2. Now the opening phase of the game has completely ended, and Magnus plays a very instructive move. So let's do some explanation for this. If Magnus had decided to castle instead of king to d2, notice that if he castles here, his king is going to be very far away from the center, and these two pawns here are going to come under great attack once one of these rooks gets to the e file and the pawn on f5 gets pushed. So in that case, these two pawns are going to be very weak, and MVL should be able to create a lot of counterplay against them. Instead, with the king on d2, the king is very close to these pawns, and he's able to put some protection in case that they need the protection. And from d2, now that there's no queens on the board, it's very hard to create any attacks on the king. So for that reason, the kings in the endgames belong in the center. Magnus is already looking that far ahead. He understands that once the middle game position clears out, if the king is closer to the center, he's going to have the advantage. Now for MVL, his plan should be to put maybe a rook on c8, another rook on e8, and maybe hit the center with d5 and f5, maybe even some move knight to b4 and try to trade some of the rooks off the board, which will make his life a lot easier. So after king to d2, MVL continues with rook from a to c8, very standard. Playing it to e8 right away would have run into some d5 and rook to c7, and his position's just collapsing. So rook a to c8 I like very much. And here Magnus goes for h4. And the new engines now play this move practically in every game. But in this situation, it makes even a lot more sense since he's trying to go h5. And if MVL just captures on h5, he's going to have a lot of weaknesses in his king. Plus, the pawn on d6 will be loose. Not to mention that if MVL never captures on h5, the Magnus is going to go forward with h6. And there's always going to be back rank issues for black. So MVL goes for knight to b4. As we mentioned, this is one of the plans. Plus, also he now has the option to trade rooks if he wants. And the knight is targeting the pawn on a2 and to trade this very strong bishop on d3. Of course, Magnus wants none of this, and he returns the bishop to b1 here. And here MVL goes for this rook from c to e8. And actually, I don't really like this move. He's giving access to Magnus to come to c7. At the moment, it doesn't work, but as you will see, in Magnus's next two moves, he's the only one improving his position, and MVL is doing absolutely nothing here. So Magnus goes for a3, knight to c6, and bishop to e2. And you can already see that Magnus is getting the upper hand in this middle game position. In the last three moves, White has been the only one to actually improve his position, and Black has only managed to play this rook from a8 to e8. Notice that he wasted some tempos by coming to c8 first, the knight to b4, then the rook to c8, to e8 and the knight back to c6. So while he wasted all that time, Magnus went bishop back to b1, bishop to a2, and now this bishop from here in this new diagonal is going to cause a lot of problems. MVL goes for rook takes e4 here, and he's known for his French school of suffering, a term coined by Magnus, I believe, in which he plays a lot of really bad positions, and he saves a lot of them, and in some cases he wins a lot of them. But in this situation, it was just complete suicide, since he's not getting enough counterplay for his sacrifice exchange. Magnus here continues with bishop to d5, knight to a5. The exchange is taken by Magnus, bishop takes on e4, and notice that going for knight takes on b3, trying to get the exchange back, just loses after king to c2, and after knight takes on c1, bishop takes on b7, and this knight here has nowhere to go, and he's just going to be down a piece. So instead, after bishop takes on e4, we have rook to c7, and with this infiltration, Black is just lost. MVL goes for a6, and Magnus continues with h5. As we mentioned earlier, he wants to create some weaknesses here. If Black doesn't capture, then he's simply going to go h6, as you will see. b5 by MVL, and he's trying to win a second pawn by playing knight to c4, knight takes on a3, and if he manages this, maybe he can save the game. h6 by Magnus. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there's always going to be back rank issues here for MVL. Bishop to f6, and bishop g5 by Magnus. And MVL goes bishop to h8. Now let's explore some other options. If bishop takes on f3 here, for example, then the game could have continued. Bishop takes on f6, bishop takes on g2, the rook comes to the open e file, knight to d5 check, king to d3, knight to b6. Taking the pawn here is not a good idea, since once these rooks double up on the e file, this bishop is going to come to g7. The rook is going to have to move somewhere, and then the rook captures on f7, and it's just going to be checkmate in a few moves. But after knight to b6, rook to a7, hitting the pawn on a6 as well. Knight to d5, hitting the bishop on f6. Bishop e7, the rook moves, but after bishop takes on d6, and knight to f6, rook to e7, the rook gets in anyway, and it's just going to be game over. Another line after bishop to g5 was to go bishop takes on g5, but knight takes on g5, bishop takes on g2, and again the rook goes into the open e file, knight c4 check, again king to d3, bishop to d5, the rook comes to a7, targeting the pawn on a6, a5, knight to e4, there's an exchange on e4, but here after these few moves, after this knight to c2, the rook comes to d1, and the plan is simple. This knight cannot just protect against these two pawns. If the pawn pushes forward, rook to d2, the knight moves and the rook captures. If this pawn just moves forward, then the pawn on a4 is dropped. So this knight cannot protect both pawns. And White's plan is very simple. He's going to go king to e7 and just march his pawn forward and win the game. So this wouldn't have worked. Instead, MVL goes for bishop to h8, but as I said, he's just going to suffer here. Magnus keeps improving his position with rook to h4. Now moves like bishop takes f3, although you're damaging the pawn structure, you're just liquidating, and this is good for white. He's just going to take, and if ever some knight to c4, king c3, knight takes here, just moves like rook to a5, and you're just going to drop both of these pawns. Bishop to d5 by MVL, he's trying to maintain some control and keeping some pieces on the board. King to c3, a beautiful maneuver by Magnus that's going to allow him to trade the knights from the board. Knight c4, knight d2, and after knight takes on e3, king b4, the knight is forced to come back, and here Magnus manages the exchange of knights. Bishop comes to e7, turning the rook, rook to e8, and Magnus goes for this beautiful rook to f4. f5 by MVL, and g4, another beautiful move, trying to completely open the position so that the rooks can get in. And king to f7. If f takes on g4, Magnus had prepared this beautiful bishop takes, rook to d8, bishop e5, bishop e6, and after a few exchanges, white is just going to collect all the pawns one by one. Instead, after king to f7, the game finishes very nicely with bishop takes, check, king e6, bishop to c5, the rook bishop comes to f6, and here Magnus just puts the finishing touch with pawn takes, rook check, the king returns, the rook captures on f5. Now this bishop on f6 is pinned and is being attacked by two pieces, so MVL has to go for this rook e6, but after d5, it is time to resign, and MVL did, and this game is over. Not the tournament Magnus wanted to have, but +2 and a win to finish, I think he will be absolutely fine. On the other hand, for MVL, he has a lot more issues to consider and to work on. He's leading the Candidates tournament, and this tournament is set to restart. Remember, it was suspended due to COVID, and it's set to restart in a couple of months, and he's leading this tournament. But his form here in the Tata Steel Masters was a complete disaster, and he lost almost 30 points of his rating. He dropped from the number 5th player in the world to, I think, number 15. So if he wants to dethrone Magnus, the player that just gave him this complete butt whooping here, he needs to find his form and he needs to play better, and he doesn't have a lot of time to do so. Alright guys, thanks for watching. If you like content like this, don't forget to like and subscribe, and don't forget to leave a comment down below. And as always, stay safe, have a great day, and show respect to your opponent. See you next time.